I got a question for you. Would you say that Canadians are as optimistic and enthusiastic as they were even 50 years ago? Would you say that our culture is on its way up, or would you say it's on its way down? How do you feel about Canada? What are you thinking? Because it may be from your point of view, things are looking really grand to you, or some of you may feel that you notice some of the cracks in our foundations. So I want to talk just from my perspective, from a Christian perspective. I see some cracks in our foundations, and I'd like to discuss some of them with you this morning. Most of you may not even be aware of this, but Canada was once a Christian nation. And as a matter of fact, as I talk a little further, you'll notice Canada really still is a Christian nation. Unfortunately, though, some things have developed that have done some damage to the foundation that was laid by the people that, the fathers of Confederation. Most of the people involved in Confederation were Christian people. Matter of fact, at the beginning of Canadian society, most of the institutions that were formed by Christians with a Christian perspective or a Christian ideology. Did you know that most of the major universities in Canada, McGill, the Ryerson, University of Toronto, there's dozens of them. They're started by Christians. And they were actually started in order to propagate not only Christianity, but science, and they're the cause of a kind of orderly culture that we're taking for granted here. But something's happened to I've noticed it as a Christian. Something's happened to our culture, and I'm concerned about it. And I think we need to know what the problem is if we're going to do something about the problem. Now, I don't expect you to be able to understand everything I'm going to talk about today. That's why much of the material is going to be put on MP3s, which you can access on the internet. And we'll go into details there. But listen, if you've been a Canadian, if you are a Canadian and you've been a Christian for any length of time, you've probably seen the situation for yourself. From a Christian perspective, I believe the Christian civilization is crumbling before our eyes. Since the publication of the Humanist Manifesto in 1933, all citizens in the West, in England, in Canada, in the United States, Australia, what we call the Christian West or the free world, have been under indoctrination by the signers of the Humanist Manifesto in 1933, and everyone that sat in public school has taken for granted that certain things are true. And one of the things that have been taught now for over 100 years in our culture is the theory of evolution. Were you raised on the theory of evolution? I was. And when I was a teenager, I believed it hook, line, and sinker. The reason I did is because my teachers believed it, the media believed it, all the books believed it. I never heard of an alternative explanation at all. I didn't hear of an alternative explanation till I became a Christian. I became a Christian when I was 30 years old. So, I was already an astute atheist by the age of 30. And one of the main reasons I was an atheist is because of the theory of evolution. It just makes sense. If the beginnings of the universe started out without God, if creatures developed by natural selection, if there's no God needed, what you wind up with is an alternative explanation for our society. And our society, the only explanation we have is the theory of evolution. And God's been written out of the picture. And so what we have is a society without God in the picture. Does that do anything? Does that change anything? I think so. I know how it affected me when I was a young man. I didn't know what was wrong. I grew up a young man. When I was 19, I became somewhat of a hippie. One of the reasons is because I read all these philosophy books, and I was looking for a purpose in life. And as an atheist, I couldn't give a solid reason for the purpose of life. I just couldn't. And so I began to fall into every kind of philosophy that was available in my generation. And this was in the 60s and the 70s. Anybody here listen to the music of the 60s and 70s? You know? I'll give you an example of the kind of stuff. I remember I was in literature class, and the teacher asked us to bring in some popular music that we really enjoyed. And so I brought in the song American Pie. Anybody know that one? And we analyzed it, and everybody had their kind of opinion about what it really meant. And we were really kind of puzzled by some of the words used. For instance, I've got it here. I wish I could read the whole thing. It is so good because it actually talks about the culture. See, Don McLean, who wrote the song, disappeared for a few years. He was already a popular singer. He disappeared for a few years. When he came back, he wrote American Pie. And you know what he did? When he wrote American Pie, he was pointing at something in the culture. A long, long time ago, I can still remember how the music used to make me smile. And I knew if I had my chance that I could make those people dance. And maybe they'd be happy for a while. But February made me shiver with every paper I deliver. Bad news on the doorstep. I couldn't take one more step. I can't remember if I cried when I read about his widowed bride, but something touched me deep inside the day the music died. They say this is, people have different interpretations, but I remember when Kennedy was shot. Do you remember where you were when Kennedy was shot? Everyone in our culture remembered the day that Kennedy was shot. And something happened to us all. And maybe McLean was talking about something else, but it's very strange. This thing, the song came out in the same era as Kennedy. Then a little later on in the song, he's talking about, oh, and there we were all in one place. A generation lost in space with no time left to start again. I remember what it was like. I'd grown up. I'd gone to public school, high school. I was heading out into supposedly a great future. But I didn't know where I was going. I had no purpose yet. After all those years, I still didn't know where I belonged. And so I'm saying this to you. There's an awful lot of people feel that way about our culture. And I think there's a connection. There's a connection between the theory of evolution, which we learned in school, and our lack of direction in our own lives. We'll get into that in a few minutes. At the end of the song, this is American Pie, he says, I met a girl who sang the blues, and I asked her for some happy news, but she just smiled and turned away. I went down to the sacred store where I'd heard the music years before, but the man there said the music wouldn't play. And in the streets the children screamed, the lovers cried and the poets dreamed, but not a word was spoken. The church bells were all broken. And the three men I admire most, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, they caught the last train for the coast the day the music died. I remember taking that in literature class, and we didn't know what this meant. We didn't understand the connection between the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. We had no Christian perspective at all. And I'm just here to tell you that, look, whatever perspective you have, we respect that perspective. My theory is this. Since we were all brought up in the same culture and we were all indoctrinated into the same ideas, all we need to hear sometimes is the other perspective. And perhaps a little later, we'll show on the screen, we have a little drawing of the two ways to look at the world. There's two kinds of ways of looking at the world. There's the secular humanist way, and there's the biblicist way. The secular humanist sees the same world that the biblicist. I'm a biblicist. I believe in God. I believe in the Bible. But the secular humanist, all he sees is whatever he can see, hear, feel, smell, and touch. He doesn't believe in the existence of anything other than what's the material universe. And as a biblicist, I believe in all that. I believe in the material universe. But I also believe that the person that made the material universe wrote a book, and that book contains the things that you can't discover by looking at the physical universe. Things like where we came from, why we were created, where we are now, and where we're supposed to be going. In other words, purposes and directions you can't get from science, you have to get from the Bible. So, unfortunately, what's happened is that the Bible was pretty well, how do they say it? Handed its hat and shown the door. In my own generation, when I was a boy, every morning we'd start in public school saying God save the Queen. We did the Lord's Prayer. We did an allegiance to the flag and to the Queen. And as a boy, I just assumed there was a God, but nothing was ever taught about it. And so as a teenager, I thought, well, God's just a myth. And so I left it. And dispensing with that did something for me and in my soul that other people in my society mention in their songs. And usually it's the songwriters in our society that mention what's going on. I still remember Simon and Garfunkel's Sounds of Silence. Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again. Because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping. And the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sounds of silence. He's a young man. He's looking at the world around him, and he sees something. There's a problem there. And at the end, he writes this. He says, and in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs that voices never share, and no one dare disturb the sounds of silence. Fool, said I, you do not know silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words that I might teach you. Take my arms that I might reach you. But my words like silent raindrops fell and echoed in the wells of silence. And the people bowed and prayed to the neon god they'd made. And the sign flashed its warning, and in the words that it was forming, and the sign said, the words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls, and whispered in the sounds of silence. As a teenager, I said, I wonder what he's talking about there. I mean, I'd heard the word prophet before, in history class, that there was such a thing as the old Hebrew prophets, but they mocked and laughed at those things, and so I never could put the two things together. And one of the things I'm trying to say to if you're an atheist or if you're a Christian, we need to talk to one another. We need to compare notes, because the Christians have a piece of the puzzle, and so do the atheists. And if we compared notes together, we find we're pretty close. I have a website, and the byword for the website is you're closer than you think. Now, some of the things that I'm seeing in my culture have got me concerned, and that's why I'm starting to speak out. I used to think I could just keep quiet and what can I do about my culture? But I realize now I can do a lot. The biggest thing that I can do is I can remind the people, my fellow Canadians, that I was an atheist, I was a secular humanist, and I couldn't get my life to work very well. I couldn't get a sense of joy and purpose and hope for the future. I was directionless. I still remember as a teenager, I went to see my guidance counselor, and this was in grade 12, for goodness sake. I never had enough sense to ask my guidance counselor in grade 9. I asked him in grade 12, where am I supposed to go from here? And he did a bit of an analysis. And he said, well, what do you think? What do you think? And so after I had spoken to him about my dreams and hopes for the future, you know what he said to me? He said, you know what? It looks like the only thing you want to do is save the world. He was mocking me. He's mocking me. I think to myself, there's an awful lot of kids out there that's exactly what they want to do. They want to save the world. As a matter of fact, I'm talking to all of those out there that want to save the world. The world needs saving. Matter of fact, if you don't think the world needs saving, you're part of the problem. Anybody here remember what's that singing group? See, I remember my past. I remember all the groups. I grew up in the days when you had albums, and they had album cover art. It was phenomenal, and the lyrics were great. And see, this is where I would like to be able to pull out of my memory these things, because that's what's important to me. But right now, I can't think of the name of the group. Supertramp.
All right, start over.
Start again?
No, just talk about, for instance, one group when I was young.
One group when I was young that I really liked was Supertramp. And they had an album, I still remember it. Well, there's a couple of them, Breakfast in America. Waitress smiling. And I used to wonder, why are they using that on an album cover for some rock and roll that was pretty heavy stuff? Because, what was that all about? And do you know what they were doing? They were sort of mocking reality. That's what they were doing. And then they did an album called Crisis. What Crisis? Anybody remember that one? Yeah? Guy sitting on a lawn chair, drinking a martini under an umbrella in his bathing suit. Crisis? What crisis? When you look in the background, I guess they took a picture of Detroit with all the factories pumping out smoke. And everywhere you look, there's rubble everywhere. Crisis? What crisis? I tell you what, as a teenager, a young man, I said, there's something wrong, something they're not telling me. There's something they're not telling me. But my fellow, poets and songwriters are telling me there's a problem here. So I've always said, yeah, I noticed that there's a problem. Do you think there's a problem in Canada? I think there is. I hear about a lot of homeless people, a lot of young people have left school, discouraged, got high school bills, no future. A lot of them are very depressed. They keep telling me this in the local papers even. Mental illness is on the rise, lots of mentally ill people. Folks, please don't misunderstand me. I don't think it's mental illness. I think it's what people believe. You believe the wrong thing. If you believe in error, it's going to affect your life and your mind. And it's going to discourage you. We have a lot of discouragement, a lot of depression, a lot of hopelessness. I've been at many funerals in the last few years. Many funerals. And what's odd is funerals of young people. I was one funeral up in Port Perry, and it was a young man, had a career. He was an electrician. He had a brand new car and a brand new truck. Popular in his community. Young man. Had a nice girlfriend. Matter of fact, had all kinds of girlfriends. I would have said he's the happiest guy in town, He committed suicide all of a sudden. And I went to the funeral out of concern because it was a distant member of my family. And when I got there, the place was packed. The funeral home was packed with people. And what was odd about it, it's almost as though the mood was not so much that they were sorry that he committed suicide, but that he was a hero. He was brave enough to take charge of his life. I've been in a few of those here in Oshawa. The young kids that commit suicide, they're the brave ones. And there's something wrong here. If suicide becomes popular, it's because of an ideology. They've got no basis. And we've got to do something about it. If you're concerned about your young people, if you're concerned about the mentally ill, if you're concerned about this euthanasia thing that's happening right now, for instance, older folks, I won't use a really old folk. I'll use Robin Williams. I mean, he's a funny man and such an encouraging guy. I mean, there's so many times when he got us laughing, he distracted us from everyday life, and then all of a sudden in the paper, he committed suicide. And there wasn't much explanation. I did a bit of digging, and he had a terminal illness, but that's not enough reason to commit suicide. That's not a good idea, because you're sending a signal out to everyone that's alive on the planet that if you don't like it down here anymore, and if it gets too tough on you, and it's a good idea just to opt out. No. Remember who you're leaving behind. The world is not as funny a place since Robin Williams left. And I miss him. And I mean, he was no great Christian or nothing like that. But you know what? He sometimes gave me hope and joy in my life. And if a man like that, who has everything, money, friends, popular, can suddenly just off himself, it sends a strong signal to our children that, you know what? If things are no longer going good, all you have to do is depart. And folks, that's an ideology that it doesn't come from Christianity, because Christianity teaches that there's a world beyond this one, and that if you die in this world, you will still be alive in the next one. See, atheism doesn't teach that. Atheism teaches that you kill yourself, that's it. You stop feeling and thinking, you stop existing, and you're gone. We never thought that way 150 years ago. Shakespeare didn't think that way. To die, to dream, perhaps to sleep, he said in one of his sonnets. And if we sleep, what dreams may come. They did make a film about that. Why? Shakespeare knew that when you die, you don't go to oblivion. You don't cease to exist. What I would like to be able to get a chance to say to young people and old people, especially some of you old guys that are, say, I just off myself if I'm tired of living. You got to understand that if life on this side is sometimes difficult, ever think that it might be more difficult on the other side? And while you can still make a decision on this side, I think it's a good idea to stick around and get the truth. I just let you know, when I was 19, I tried to commit suicide. And I'm so glad it didn't work, because, it took another 11 years, and I learned a truth that absolutely changed everything and gave me back zeal and hope and joy and gave me life. As a matter of fact, I remember saying one time, I said, I've never enjoyed life before, and now I enjoy every minute of it. And it's because I changed my ideology. And that's what we're trying to do. If you want a strong country, if you want Canada to be strong for another 150 years, I think we need to consider another way of looking at things, a different perspective. And that's what I'm trying to talk about. Now, just to change the corner for a second, I would like to go and hit hard at what changed our perspective. Because as I went through history and English literature, I found that in the past, an awful lot of people were Christian. A lot of the most famous poetry in history is Christian. I think of John Donne, 1624. He wrote this. I memorized it. It's been part of my life, all my life. He says, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. As well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." You know what that is? That's the Christian respect for human life. A human life is important. When I was a boy, I liked the Lone Ranger. Do you know that the Lone Ranger, we learned about, he had Tonto as his sidekick, and what was his horse's name? Was it Trigger? No, that's Roy Rogers. But do you know what he had in his gun? Anybody know? What did the Lone Ranger have in his gun? He had silver bullets. I remember that as a boy. And when I was a boy, I said, what's with the silver bullets? I was told that he had such a respect for human life that he would only kill if he had to kill. And we've got a culture right now that killing is part of the culture. Kids are taking these video games and shooting and killing people. And you know what? That's not Christian. That comes from another ideology altogether. Now, you want to know what that ideology is? Actually, If I tell you, you're probably going to get up and leave, right? Is that the way it works? But I've been on both sides of the fence, and I can tell you that Christianity suffered a major blow 150 years ago. 150 years ago, I think I got a poem written by a fella 150 years ago, and here's what he wrote. He says, "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled," saying the Christian faith was like something you wear. But now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and the naked shingles of the world. He was standing at the white cliffs of Dover, and he saw the tide going out. And when he wrote Dover Beach, he wasn't talking about the tide going out on the beach. He was talking about the tide of Christianity. The tide had turned. Christianity was headed out. The last stanza in this little poem, he says, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams." I remember when I was a little child, the world was like a land of dreams. So various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light nor certitude nor peace nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of trouble, struggle, and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. What do we see in the world? Armies, death, destruction. Part of that is because the tide of Christianity has gone out. This was in 1867, about 150 years ago. Now, another thing that happened 150 years ago, the most significant thing that I think that we need to keep in mind was a man by the name of Charles Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of Species. And that book, he was able to document the fact that there really was no need for God or religion. There was no need for a creator because the world was formed by natural selection, by natural processes. And at the time, he was able to see things like simple one-celled animals slowly evolved into complex life forms. Well, see, at the time, nobody could correct him because it did look like an amoeba was a one-celled animal. But think about it. Grade 9, I used to have a bunch of guys in my classroom that were like amoebas. They were like one-celled animals. See, they've since discovered that an amoeba is an incredibly complex organism. And all of life is incredibly complex. Darwin couldn't have known that. We've only discovered that in the last few years. In the last 200 years, or the last 150 years, we discovered life is incredibly complex. And as a matter of fact, if I were to somehow summarize the antidote for the poison of this faulty doctrine called the theory of evolution, I would say, I think we finally found the antidote. And that's one of the reasons why we're having these sessions. I think the antidote for evolution is truth that we could not have known in Darwin's day that we have discovered since that day. And bottom line, you know what that truth is? It's called design. We have discovered by looking at every aspect of the universe that the universe is incredibly designed down to the most infinite degree. And this is the first time in history we were able to make this argument. I think about this. I don't know if you could have done this in Shakespeare's day or in ages past. It's only now in our day that we begin to see what design really means. For instance, take out your cell phone. Everybody got a cell phone? Do you know that there's 7.9 billion mobile gadgets in the world? There's more mobile gadgets than there are people in this world. And the micro components in the average cell phone number in the millions. For instance, the 2006 Intel Core has 150 million transistors printed into the circuit board. When I was a boy, I had a transistor radio, 9 transistors. You got 151 million transistors in that, and that's just the little object you hold in your hand. There have to be thousands of servers. They had to invent the World Wide Web. There has to be a satellite orbiting at 22,000 miles in space for this system to work. Now we're beginning to see the complexity of design. Things like this don't happen by accident. And the more we look into it, tell you what, we'll go into detail in the short videos that we'll put on, but let me just throw a couple of ideas at you quickly now, because we don't want to make this too long. Some of the things that we know now in our generation that Darwin couldn't have known about is we know about because of the discoveries. For instance, in the 1950s, the scientists Watson and Crick discovered DNA. They discovered that even in a one-celled animal like an amoeba, there are strands of DNA, and the DNA it's such a complex amount of information, it's just mind-boggling. Scientists have discovered that around 700 terabytes of information can be stored in a single gram of DNA. How big is your computer? How much does the average computer hold? 1 terabyte? 2 terabytes maybe? A gram of DNA can hold 700 terabytes. Now we're beginning to see that the universe is incredibly designed. Secondly, and this is only recent, they had the Human Genome Project. Have you heard about that? And where what they did is they went back into the genome of all the people on the planet, took an analysis of it, and you know what they discovered? We all come from the same 2 people. Now, Bible said that right from the very beginning. So what I'm saying is science is confirming what the Bible says. The Bible had no way. Can you imagine in the book of Genesis, if God had said, well, if you study the genome and you study the DNA strands, you'll discover that the universe is incredibly designed by me. They wouldn't have known what that meant. So God just says, I created it. We're not the product of evolution, we're the product of design. Another principle, I'm going to throw these out and we'll explain it in more detail on other tapes. In 1970, a scientist by the name of Dyson Carter introduced what's become known as the anthropic principle. Have you ever heard of the anthropic principle? I've known pastors and teachers that have never heard of the anthropic principle. I only came across it a few years ago myself. I wondered, why is this a secret? And what the anthropic principle does is that not only is the universe designed, it's fine-tuned for life to the degree, just as an example, God had to fine-tune what's the most abundant element or the abundant thing on planet Earth. What's one of the most abundant things? Water. The Earth is 70% water, whatever. It's made of hydrogen and oxygen. The way that oxygen and hydrogen work together produces an element that produces this strange thing called water. And the more detail you get into, you see when God created the hydrogen and the oxygen, he had to pre-plan water. He had to pre-plan the things that flow in your body. Everything had to be designed from scratch. Another thing I've discovered in our studies here, even human civilization had to be designed. And we got some pretty eye-opening videos that we share can't do it here, but later. But human civilization was designed. All the great civilizations of the past, like what the Egyptian and the Greek, the Roman civilization, they were not perfect, but tell you what, they were well organized. They had law, they had science, they had almost everything that we have in art. You know what Canadians are doing? We're taking it for granted, but we live in one of the most well-organized, intelligent societies on the whole planet. the systems we have are so complex. And we think all this kind of happened by accident. No, it was pre-designed. As a matter of fact, in another session, we'll talk about the fact that God actually put down a law for the design of civilization. And there's actually we'll share that with you. Anybody guess what's the ultimate law of civilization? Anybody know? Well, if you don't know, then you better come back, do some more. So what we're trying to say is, we've learned since Darwin's day that we are the benefactors of design, and God designed it. As a matter of fact, let me throw this at you, if I have a moment. One of the big problems, one of the reasons why so many people abandon the church is because we were always talking about sin. And yes, sin is still in the world. And yes, we're all sinners. And yes, we need to be saved from sin. But that's not the only perspective that we need to take. And as a matter of fact, what's happened over several centuries of preaching, etc., we're always saying, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. It's like as if God is micromanaging the universe. And that we can't do anything without checking with God first. And what I've noticed now is that was never what was intended. See, God designed things, and when you design something to work, every element in a system has to work within boundaries. And when you go outside those boundaries, the whole system starts to collapse. So, for instance, a quick example, say I had a $70,000 electric car. What kind of car was that? The Tesla. I took a drive in a Tesla. It's absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. Okay? I think it runs on, off the top of my head, I don't know how many volts it runs on. But you can't plug it into a voltage that it doesn't suit it. You destroy the entire system by going outside the boundaries. If a car is supposed to run on 70 volts, you can't run it on 240 volts. You can't run your 5-volt cell phone on a 220-volt outlet. And we all understand that. For the first time in history, we're beginning to understand how critical design is. And so, as I was studying these things, I began to see that really all this thing about sin is looking at bad and good from a moral perspective. And you know what? We're always moralizing, and people are against our moralizing. Well, it doesn't have to come from a moral perspective. It can come from a design perspective. Let me throw this at you. I believe, and I've lived it now for several years, that any thought or action in harmony with design is good, right, or true. Any thought or action in harmony with design is good, right, or true. You should write that down and think it through. Come back and listen to some more stuff. We'll make some applications. I'm just trying to say any thought or action in harmony with design is good, right, and true. Any thought or action contrary to design is bad, wrong, and error. So you know what we're doing? We're moralizing, like, is it wrong to speed? Well, yeah, but that's making it into a moral thing. Well, you know what's wrong with speeding? It's not designed. It's going against design. Our roads are designed for what? 5 million people to rush to work in the mornings? I'm sorry. Everyone has to drive within certain boundaries, and those boundaries are set by what we call the speed limit. Well, if the police can have speed limits, then certainly God can have some limits. And God says, I designed life a certain way. I designed a man and a woman to get married and have children. Well, you can't go out of those design laws and expect things to work very well. I designed life for certain things. You can't just do anything, and that's what our culture's doing. Freedom is, I can do whatever I want. No, that's not freedom. That's chaos. That's what's happening in our culture. That's what you see. You know why our budgets you know why we're over budget? You know why our hospitals are full? Because We've all gone past certain boundaries. I can drink what I want to drink. I can watch what I want to watch. I can smoke what I want to smoke. I can do anything I want to do with anybody. I can cross all the boundaries because I'm free. And as a result, there's all these negative consequences. People are hooked on drugs. People are sexually abused. People are, there's all kinds of problems. Look at what's going on with television. I see, 8-year-olds playing video games where they're shooting one another? I've never heard of anything like that. It's way beyond design. Tell you what, if you begin to look into it, it's the most liberating idea I've heard in a long time. And I wasn't sure that I was onto this matter of design until I was done all these sessions for True North, got all this material together. And then one day, I got the answer for a really big question, and it just came out of the blue. Every year we go camping, and when we go out camping, there's a dam that we go on to at night, and we look at the night sky. And 'cause in Algonquin Park, there's no night shine, so you can see the whole Milky Way. And a few years ago, we began asking questions like this. We said, if we really are in the Milky Way, and the Milky Way, at the center of the Milky Way, there's this gigantic ball of stars. It ought to be the brightest thing in the sky. Why can't we see that gigantic ball in the middle of the Milky Way galaxy? And we had a whole bunch of different reasons and stuff, but nobody could come up with one. Well, I think we got our answer. What's happened is God designed not only the Earth and the solar system, but actually the placement of the Earth within the galaxy. And it's just absolutely astounding, and I don't want to mess with this one. I'd rather you see it for yourself. A film was made, and I came across it quite by accident. It's called The Privileged Planet. And as a matter of fact, in our literature, I'll give you some handouts later, we have the links to the website. What we need to do is we need to get this film, we need to watch it in its entirety, and you'll see God designed the universe in an incredible way. And that's exactly what it says in the scriptures. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. And when you look at the universe through design and the eyes of design, you realize there's no way that this could have happened by accident. And that's what scientists all over the world are discovering. And actually, more scientists are coming to the Lord because of their studies than ever before in history. And so what we want to do is we want to take what science is finding, we want to take the material that that Christians have found over the years, we want to combine them together. And what we want to do is we want to liberate the people to really, really live and enjoy life. And I'm looking for one last quote. I use it as a quote here. There's so much material, and we'll give it to you in bite-sized pieces. We'll make it available to you so that you can get a hold of it. And here's the last quote. This is from a scientist, not a Christian, atheist scientist. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. The Bible is the Word of God. It's the operations manual for the universe. It's actually the design manual of the universe. It shows you how we are designed, how we're designed to live in harmony with one another. God never intended for there to be war. He didn't intend for there to be poverty. He didn't intend for there to be disease. We're not running things according to design, but the Bible's been given us so that we can go back and do it by design. We'll talk more about, there's so much to talk about. This is a big topic, I know, sorry about that, but if we're going to see our Canadian society restored to the kind of hope and joy and purpose we once had, we're going to have to go back to the God, the Creator God, go back to the Bible, and go back to some things that no one has even talked about for these last 50 years. Design. So come on back. I think it was by design you showed up here tonight, and hopefully by design you will come and watch the rest of things in the future. So thank you for coming out. Please follow up on all the stuff on the website and on our literature. And hope we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Good night.